And I guess there's no point in hiding it because we're going to feel it, but the power curve all the way up the front side was less on that 18. And then just at the super high RPMs, you're getting like 10,000 RPMs. Then it crosses over, and it made way more peak power, and it revved further. But anytime you give up, like where you're spending most of your time on the track, it's all that face, that front side. And so I was stunned that they gave all that up just to get that little bit of peak. And I kept asking questions like, why did you guys go this route? I mean, surely you could have made something either in the middle of the two or, kind of a happy medium. I feel like you gave up all this low and middle for this over-rev, and they said, well, this design is going to allow for further development, in terms of aftermarket and models that come down the road.
That's David Pingree sharing some insight on some of the new bikes from last year, and then from this year, we have officially rolled into new bike season. It's crazy that June has kind of become the month where you hear about next year's bikes, and that is only literally halfway through the year that you're in. This week, Suzuki finally announced its 2019 lineup. Yes, it's odd that I use the word finally, even though it's still just July. So now the entire 2019 motocross bike puzzle is complete. All 6 of the major manufacturers have at least shown what their bikes will look like and given some of the information. Not all the bikes have been out for riding yet or for purchase yet. Probably about half have been. But I thought since all the bikes at least have been announced, it was a good time to ring up our man, David Pingree, our chief test riding ace with RacerX, to give you an idea of where the bikes stack up for 2019. Now, I realize that not everyone listening to this podcast is racing at their local track every single weekend and needs to know which 250 and 450 bike is the fastest so they can go and win races and live their life off of contingency. I know that. So I tried to, in this conversation, talk to Ping not just about each bike individually, but some of the philosophies behind the bikes. If they're good and bad when they make changes. Maybe a bike that's a few years old, is it still good enough? Do certain bikes actually work for certain riders, even if it's not the best for pros? And we do a lot of comparison between what you see on the actual track at the pro level and the same feelings that they're having with their works bikes. Because remember, the works bikes have to be based on production machines. They have to have essentially a stock frame. The transmission cases and the engine cylinder and whatnot have to be based on the stock machine, even the swing arm too. So there are always going to be characteristics of a production bike that carry over into the works bike. So we try to tie that in to continue to explore what allows people to win races at the highest level. And sometimes it is bikes. Even though they can change a ton at their level, the base platform really puts them in a certain box they've got to work from. So I'm going to make this a little more of a wide, varied talk about motorcycles as opposed to just what bike should I buy for 2019. And we even tackle the can you feel the difference between a Husqvarna and a KTM in this podcast, which is the question that gets asked all the time. And one other question I'm always asked, why do you keep using this song? Podcast, 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 podcast. Yeah, there it is. Beautiful, sweet music. I'm going to get to David Pingree and this week's RacerX Exhaust podcast about new bikes in just a moment. But first, let's mention our sponsor, Yoshimura. 63 years of experience with research and development of four-stroke exhaust systems. Check them out for everything you need for your dirt bike, your street bike, your ATV. Yoshimura exhaust would probably help with a lot of the motorcycles you hear here. Ping is going to mention specifically a Suzuki really benefits from an exhaust system, so maybe make it a Yosh. And shout out to the folks in the sweatshop putting the Racer X Wear t-shirt line together. We have Motocross of Nations shirts en route, so go to racerxbrand.com. That's racerxbrand.com. shortly. I think by the end of the week, we should have Motocross of Nations shirts up. We have a couple designs we've already approved. Now we're just trying to go through the appropriate hoops to figure out where we're allowed to sell them and stuff like that. Because after the RedBud National, everyone has really had that little reality crisis of, oh my gosh, RedBud Motocross of Nations, it's really going to happen. It is coming. It is coming sooner than you think. This is going to be amazing and awesome. By the way, after the RedBud National last Saturday, I asked Amy Ritchie. Amy and her brother Tim essentially run RedBud now. It was their parents' track. They've taken it over. I said to Amy, hey, are you worried at all about Motocross of Nations? I expected the answer to be no, because we've come to expect that RedBud can handle anything, and there'd be nothing to worry about for them ever, no matter what happened. But she actually was genuinely worried. The worry is that the event will be too popular, and RedBud will not have enough space within its 250-some acres to fit enough bodies and park enough cars and trucks. So she took me on a ride all the way around RedBud. I got to see corners of the property I didn't even know existed, just to give me an idea of what they're working with and how they're trying to accommodate what should be an absolutely earth-shattering crowd at what could be maybe the coolest motocross race that has ever taken place in the history of the sport. That's Motocross of Nations at RedBud in October. So that was really interesting, but it's really sinking in. So we're working on shirts. We've got to figure out, who we're even sending to the race. Everybody wants to go. Everyone wants to go just as a fan if they're not working. It's all starting to happen. And, of course, a lot of talk about who's going to be riding for the various teams as well. Once that RedBud National hit, Motocross of Nations fever hit as well. I can tell you the track is going to change a little bit. The start at RedBud has to change because the mechanics area for MXGP and Motocross of Nations is so long. If they tried to extend the current mechanics area at RedBud, it would actually go from where the mechanics area ends now, and it would touch the current starting gate. Probably don't want to have the mechanics area right next to the starting gate, because then the only way the riders could go by it, they'd have to ride over the starting gate. So instead, they've going to build a new mechanics area that goes into where the pro pits are now, which allows them to build a longer straightaway, and they'll use that straightaway as a new start just for Motocross of Nations. So the start at the National won't be used at Of Nations. Instead, the start will basically go from where the pro pits are now and into what is currently turn 2. That will become turn 1 at Motocross of Nations. And if you want to see what that's actually going to look like, RedBud's going to hold a race called Edge of Summer, September 7th and 8th, I believe, 7, 8, 9. And the plan is to use the Motocross of Nations layout at that event. So you can actually go ride it, and that'll be their little test run to see how the track's going to work with a couple other changes they have to do. But I've been assured Larocco's Leap will stay. It will be there for Motocross of Nations. Don't worry. So that's going to be awesome. So Motocross of Nations fever has hit. Go to racerxbrand.com. Check out all our shirts, and I'll even give you a deal. Type in exhaust in all caps for a promo code, and we'll give you 20% off your order. And that could include the Motocross of Nations shirts if you just give us a day or two. I'm sure by Friday we should have it dialed, if not today, Thursday, when you're listening to it. So that's it. Yoshimura Exhaust, big thanks to them, and big thanks to David Pingree. Let's talk motorcycles. My first question to Ping was simply this. When an all-new motorcycle rolls out, is that always a step forward? Because sometimes you hear it takes 2 or 3 years to really work out the bugs with a machine. And I love that because it's really just an excuse that all the riders use when they want to blame setup. If you have an all-new bike and you're struggling, you say, well, it's a new bike. We don't have all the bugs worked out. If you have a bike that hasn't been redesigned in a few years, you say, well, this platform is old. There's only so much we can do. So it's just whatever they want to use. The perfect example actually was the last time KTM had a factory edition bike come out a few years ago. This would have been 2015. The 2015 bike that Ryan Dungey was racing was essentially the 2016 KTM. That's how KTM does it. They have the factory edition, which every few years becomes the new redesigned model, and it gets onto the racetrack a year early. But they didn't have a factory edition or Rockstar edition Husqvarna that year. So Jason Anderson was essentially racing an older model bike than Dungey was with Husqvarna. And I remember asking one of the KTM principals, aren't the Husky people a little bit bummed that they didn't get a new bike? And he said, well, often you can look at shootouts and what the media says, a refined bike that's been out 3 or 4 years is better than something that's all new. Well, maybe, but in that case, Dungey's bike was obviously awesome, so maybe not that time. So that's my first question to Ping. Does redesigning a bike actually help?
Yeah, I mean, like you mentioned, they'll bring out a new model, and then there's always a life cycle for that. That's typically 4 to 6 years. Some bikes, if they're still relevant, they'll let it run a little longer. And I'm sure there's a lot of factors that go into that, making that decision. But to retool and create new frame and new engine, cases and all, and it's expensive. So when they make an investment to make a big change, in order to make it worth their money, worth their while, it has to run a certain number of years. So, yeah, we kind of have an idea like, okay, this next year should be a new Suzuki 250 because it's been 8 years or whatever. So you start to have an idea. I mean, and they ran it a little long, right? I mean, talking about that specific bike, but again, I'm sure that there's budgetary meetings and things that go on in Japan that factor in when they do that. But typically, let's just say the average is about 5 years out of each model.
Okay, now in your experience, when the new model shows up, for sure there's all kinds of hype and people get pumped, but when it actually comes down to riding it for several months, is the first year version of the all-new one sometimes worse because they've refined the other one so much? Is it always a step forward, or sometimes does it take 2 or 3 years, and maybe it's not as sexy 2 or 3 years into the new model, but that's the peak? The peak is 2 or 3 years later, or is the first one always pretty good?
It just depends. Sometimes they make a major improvement. And the Kawasaki, the 2019 KX450, to me is a great example of that. Okay. They just hit the mark. A lot of times they'll do all their testing with their American riders, their Japanese riders. They get this really great setting, and then somewhere between the last day of testing and them switching on the production lines, something gets lost, and the bike will come out. And I've heard this from, as an example, Chris Wheeler at Suzuki. He's like, man, we tested so much. This thing was so good, and then he goes, we finally got the first bike off the production line, and it was so not good, So sometimes there's just something that gets lost. You figure that could be a little material that was left on the frame, it's subtle little things that can make a big difference. You look at guys changing engine hangers or drilling a hole in it and putting that on, and they're like, oh yeah, that's it. That's the feel I've been looking for. So very subtle changes can make a big difference, particularly in chassis. Mm-hmm. But even in performance with the engine, if your casting leaves some burrs or doesn't have as good of a finish as a pre-pro bike does, that affects performance. So that can happen. So as an example, the 2019 Kawasaki 450, man, they hit that thing out of the park, in my opinion. Mm-hmm. And that was a big change that had been several years coming. To go the other direction, if you look at the 2009 Honda 450, there was all this hype. It had this really sharp, aggressive new look, all this stuff. You're thinking, oh, man, this bike's going to be great. And it was not. And it took them a long time to get that bike right. I would say just going back a couple years to 2017, to me, it was kind of the where they finally got that generation of bike right. Wow. Another bike I would tell you is the Yamaha 450, and when they went to that reverse engine style, obviously it was a radical change, and everybody's kind of stoked on the look and whatever. And I would tell you they're still searching to make that thing feel the way they want it to feel. It's certainly made huge improvements over the years, but it's still kind of like a love it or hate it kind of bike. And in my experience, bigger, taller guys like it. Mm-hmm. Shorter, smaller guys just don't care for the feel of it. So that's an interesting one for sure. But you can see where sometimes they hit the mark, sometimes they don't, and that's pretty common.
It is funny how, me growing up, say, reading Motocross Action or other magazines that tested bikes going all the way back, say, the 80s and 90s, there is a general philosophy, it seems, that each company has. And it's like, you figure eventually there's turnover. It can't be the same test riders and engineers for decades. But don't each of the brands still kind of have the same feel? It's a totally different bike. We're talking 2-strokes and 4-strokes, but like, yeah, Yamahas and Kawas seem stable. Suzuki's always turn. Honda's usually turn pretty well. It's weird how they've kept those same qualities for decades. Is that still the case from when you ride these things? It's still like a Kawi's a Kawi?
I would say, truly, I would say until this year, that's probably pretty true.
Mm-hmm.
And this new bike has a much different feel.
The Kawi.
For whatever reason.
Uh-huh.
The Kawi does.
Uh-huh.
Suzuki's have always cornered well and still do.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a trait that's carried through. The Yamaha is just all different, so I don't think that can really apply there. So, I would say yes and no. It is curious. I think that, like, if you take Suzuki, for example, they've always been known as these great turning bikes, and I think that because that's such a strong point for them, they try to figure out, why does it turn so well? What geometry, what characteristics of our frame and chassis help that feeling? And then whatever we do going forward, let's make sure we don't lose that. That's,
mm-hmm.
That's our strength. So, I imagine that that's deliberately done by those engineers. Of course, I'm not sitting in the room, but just speaking with some of those test riders, Chris Wheeler in particular, who did a lot of their test riding, and Rich Taylor, I know those guys always make sure they don't lose those good things, and then they try to improve upon the things that it needs to do better.
So what do you like so much about this new Kawasaki? Yeah, we have the dialed-in video. You're the first intro test for the dialed-in video went up recently, and there were some raves. So what do you like so much about this new Kawasaki?
Yeah, well, the first day on it, I thought I just was so comfortable right away. It was just everything felt like it was right where it needed to be. The bike turned well. The power was not so crazy that it was tough to ride, but it certainly didn't want for more horsepower. I mean, just everything about it just was right. There was nothing I wanted to change or really get too far off on settings on. And sometimes you'll just have a good day. You just get on and, man, everything's clicking, and you could go ride it somewhere else and feel completely different. And so, I was cautiously optimistic. The second day we went to a different place, and I was really going, okay, I wonder if I'm going to jump on and feel the way I did the other day on this thing. And because truly I've never been on a 450 Kawasaki. I've never been that comfortable. They've always felt a little tall, long, and then they went to that separate function fork, and I just couldn't get along with that thing. It never felt great. So I never got off of Kawi and went, oh man, I love that motorcycle. Mm-hmm. Not a stock one.
Yep.
And this bike I just got off and I loved it. And so the second day, it was like the same scenario. 2 laps in, I'm, jumping everything, and I'm just like, man, I feel like invincible on this bike. It makes you feel like a better rider than you are. And so to answer your question, one, it's just the comfort, just something about it. It just feels comfortable, and everything seems to be where it needs to be and working right. If I have to point to one thing that I really love, and for me is very important in the handling and the way I feel on a bike, it's the fork.
Mm-hmm.
This whole foray into air forks has been really difficult on my wrists and all the rest of it. And so this fork is literally a copy of a Showa A-kit fork put into production. And as I've said before, that's a $3,500 buy if you were to go pick a set of those up a la carte, for an old bike.
Mm-hmm.
That's what a lot of these factory teams are using. That's what the Pro Circuit Splitfire teams using.
Yep.
So this is a huge deal to have this on a production bike, and they've still got the coating on the sliders. The internals are coated. It's not like they did this real cheapy knockoff of it. It's legit.
Yeah, there's a way to define that. There's a way to prove, like, they didn't just decide, it's the same millimeter fork, so we're calling it an A-kit. Like, there's certain parameters that make it an A-kit fork. Like, that's not just hype. That's legitimate that it's an A-kit.
Well, it's all the same design.
Uh-huh.
And in the actual A-kit fork, you may have shims or little parts and pieces in there that are made of better materials that are just really expensive. And so maybe some of that was they used different materials to make it more cost effective. but all of the dimensions, the design, everything else is the same. So let's call it, 90 to 95% of what a Showa A-kit fork is in terms of performance. That's still incredible. And with any fork, setup is always key, right? I mean, you could have a works fork, and if it's set up for Ken Roxon and he doesn't ride like you or weigh what you weigh, you're going to hate it. So it's not like you bolt something on and for everybody it's just magical. It's all in the setup. But with this bike, that's another, reason I tip my cap to these guys. It seems like everybody that rides it really likes that fork. Some of them say it's a little too soft, and they've kind of already come with a fix for that. As I mentioned in the dialed-in video, you can go to it comes with a 5.0 spring in it, so you throw a 5.2 in one leg and leave the 5.0 in the other, and it gives you like this 5.1 ratio, which is just a really nice kind of spot in the middle where you still get this soft initial feel, but it holds up a little better coming into turns and places where guys were saying it felt a little soft. For me, at 172, it was pretty dang close. I talked to some lighter kids who bought the bike and have been emailing me back and forth, and I feel like if you're under 170, you probably need to go to a lighter shock spring, but the fork is perfect for you. If you're a little bit bigger, the shock spring is good, but you probably need to adjust the fork. Anybody over 180. So that's sort of the breakover for it. And again, like I said, you have to pick a target weight for these production bikes. You can't make a suspension setting that works good for a 155-pound kid and a 210-pound guy. I mean, that doesn't exist. That was part of the allure of this air fork was, well, if they just pump it up, we don't have to worry about changing springs. Well, for that little benefit, you lost a lot of performance. So, yes, you're going to have to get a fork spring to match your weight. And, like I said, they got to have one under 170 and over 180 is probably where your tipping point is. So they shot for 175-ish maybe on this bike as far as a target weight. And it's pretty dang good at that in that range.
You mentioned that Kawai's always felt a little bit big, and like I said, I feel like that's always been the philosophy. In fact, even Ryan Villapoto told me, he's like, look, I knew I was never going to just knife underneath Dungey on a KTM. I had to work the outsides. That's the way the Kawai wants to be, and you can't make a bike be something it doesn't want. You've got to ride to the strengths of the bike, and luckily for him, he rode Kawais almost his whole life, so he was able to do that. So is that there, or is this actually like a legitimately nimble, smaller feeling? I know it's not necessarily lighter because they have electric start on it and a coil spring fork, but is it lighter feeling and nimbler and corner better now?
Yeah, absolutely. And, all of these companies are going with the mass centralization, which gives the bike a lighter feeling, even though that Kawai, for example, is the exact same weight as the bike last year. They really went to work putting it on a diet so they could add the hydraulic clutch and add the electric start and not put more weight on it. So that was an accomplishment in itself. But, yeah, it does. It still has the Kawai feel and probably doesn't turn as tight as, say, a KTM or a Suzuki. But it's now completely, workable. It's not one of these bikes that you have to have a berm to make the thing change direction. I was able to, turn down, pop through tight little ruts, and just do it really comfortably and effortlessly. So whatever they've done is a big improvement.
You rode the Husky 450 down at Baker's factory. First, just tell me about that whole experience. Had you ever been able to go there before, or was that your first visit?
No, that was my first visit. And aside from being reminded of how crushing the humidity can be back there in the East Coast, the place was incredible. You roll into there, and it's funny. Like, to me, Alden, what makes him so good is his just his attention to detail. He's got OCD, is what it would appear like. From you walk into a door, and everyone's shoes are lined up in this perfect little row, and there's a perfect little mat that just fits them, and everything has its place, and it's just so. And he's got a list of things to do. Okay, when you leave this room, turn the AC up to this number, close this door, do this. Like, it's just, he doesn't leave any stone unturned, nothing, no T uncrossed, no I not dotted, right? Mm-hmm. So that's how he approaches his training. which is why he's so successful. He makes sure these riders are doing every single little thing, and that equates to better results fitness-wise, but also a lot of mental strength, knowing that you've done everything absolutely correctly, right?
Yep.
So this property is the same way. I mean, the way the grass was mowed, nothing was out of place, and it's 100 acres. You know, it's a pretty big spot.
Mm-hmm.
So pretty incredible. And we didn't even get to ride the big track. We kind of rode I guess what he calls the 250 track, which is tighter and a little slower, but you can see where these guys get in such good shape. Not only the heat and humidity, but it's like you could never rest on this track. There was just no place to relax and kind of like lay down on the seat and lay on the throttle. You were constantly working. And so it was exhausting for me. I haven't had to try to go down to that kind of weather and push that hard. I had to ride 6 different bikes that day. I beat myself up pretty good, but what an incredible facility, and it certainly makes sense why everybody's kind of flocking to that southeast, just between the dirt and the weather and these facilities that are popping up. Pretty incredible.
Did you do that here and there, even at like Ricky's, like way back in your pro circuit days during the summer, or was it just maybe around Daytona time? Did you ever really do that? I know it wasn't quite at the hot thing in the 90s, like now it's almost a must, but did you do that a little bit?
I did do it a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
I stayed with Ricky for a little bit in '97, his rookie year, my last year with pro circuit, and then years after that, I would go and stay with Brock Sellards back in Ohio, and I've always been kind of a homebody, so I didn't love going back there and, you know, living out of a suitcase at someone else's house. And
right.
It's a little different because you're staying with somebody and you almost feel like you're opposing. And it's just a little those places where you pay a fee and you're welcome to all of it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and you probably have a place
certainly
that
an
you live
advantage.
In, Yep.
You have nothing else. The competition of having other riders that are fast to ride with, and then just being comfortable in that humidity. I just, your body literally can't cool itself off. I was coming in and dumping water on my head. I'm like, nothing's working. Like I'm going to die. I mean, that's kind of how you feel at a certain point. But after you're there for 7 or 10 days, your body acclimates. And I remember going to nationals, after I'd stayed with Brock for 2 or 3 weeks. Like, man, it's so cool at all these nationals, you know. And then all the mechanics, they're sweating their faces off, you know, the guys that flew in from Cali. And they're like, it's not cool. You're just used to it. You know, that's why you need to go back there and stay in the summer. So anyway, yeah, a little bit back then, but there wasn't these really sweet setups like they have now.
Okay, so these new Huskies, let's first attack this part. So Husqvarna and KTM always get mad when people refer to Husqvarnas as white KTMs because they swear there are subtle, notable differences of the bike, but for some reason they don't. It's not like they ever put out a press release that says, here's the difference between the two. They never acknowledge it. Now, one time in Vegas this year, I was out at a typical late night in Vegas with some high-ranking KTM and Husqvarna people, and they started to tell me some of the differences, and then I yelled at them and said, why don't you tell us this? Because you claim they're not white KTMs, but then you don't tell us what's different. So can you, having ridden them, do you notice a difference between a Husqvarna and a KTM? Or does it seem like the same exact bike?
No, there is a subtle difference in feel.
Okay.
And it's more noticeable when you ride them back to back. Like if you rode one day and then a couple weeks later you rode the other, you know, it would feel very similar. I mean, look, it's the same engine, right?
Right.
You know, let's not blow a bunch of smoke up each other's rear ends. It's the same exact engine. It's the same exact frame.
Mm-hmm.
The difference comes in the subframe, which is made of a different material, and I guess can change the way that it works and feels a little bit. I think the bigger difference is the swing arm, which has a little bit less material on one than the other.
Uh-huh.
And so that just gives it a different flex characteristic. And what's interesting to me, I wonder, of course, I don't know if they would even tell you this, but I wonder if they're using, like all of them use a Husqvarna swing arm for Supercross, and they all go to a KTM swing arm for outdoors. Because one's stiffer, one's got more flex.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I wonder if there is some, hey, we're going to use that for this, and then we'll all switch to that, and then we both have the best of both worlds. I don't know. It's a guess, but it's interesting that they're just a little bit different, like sort of more geared for a different feel.
Yeah, what I heard, and again, I don't know why they're like, no, we don't put that out there in public. The Husky supposedly is supposed to be a little more comfortable for like the average guy, or maybe more of a vet guy, and they said it's even some subtle things with ergos, like even the sweep of the bars is maybe a little bit further back, and the KTM is maybe a little bit more aggressive. So if anything, it's like saying the KTM's for like a younger, more aggressive guy, and a Husky's for a little bit older guy. They don't want to say that because you know how it is. People just say, well, I want the fastest, best, most aggressive thing out there. So it's not really, it doesn't sound cool to say that that's what the Husqvarna is, but they said depending on who you are, you might hop on the Husky and actually like it better. Maybe the little bit more flex from that subframe, or if that's what they're going for, the swing arm. Maybe all those subtle things make you feel better, but you're right. They can probably pick and choose parts for the race bikes to get whatever they want when they want it.
Yeah, and I want to say there was something different in the handlebar, too. Like it comes with a different bar, and there's something. So
they told me that,
different feel because of those things, so I think the bottom line is they're not that different, so they don't want to broadcast what is different, because then you'll go, well, yeah, it's pretty much a white KTM.
Yeah, handlebars and pegs.
Really? which is fine, because it's a great bike either way, right? I mean, I don't think people really care that much. It's almost like don't try to like smoke and mirror me though, bro. I can see what I can look at it until it's pretty damn close. No one company owns the other.
Yeah, that's the part that always gets me. I'm like, don't say, just leave it alone. Just let us say what we want to say. Stop arguing. Okay, what is this bike like? So we'll start with the 450, and I guess the KTM 450, coincidentally, is also new, just like the Husky, coincidentally. But you haven't ridden that one yet, but you have ridden the Husky. So what's the Husky 450 like?
Yeah, haven't ridden the KTM yet. That's coming up. We just haven't been able to connect on a date, but rode all the Huskies. And kind of a common theme for all those Huskies is they've really tried to make the motors feel like they have a light, free revving feeling. And that's something that you'll hear riders talk about that a lot, like it's really free. So it might make the same power on a dyno, but it's the way that it makes it, how quickly it revs up, which is, all kinds of internals that go into that and mapping. Mm-hmm. But you want it, when it has a light, quick feel to it, the whole bike feels lighter. And literally it could be the same weight, it could be, nothing changed, but you change the way that power delivers, and all of a sudden, man, the whole bike feels really light. And so they've done that with all the bikes, and they all kind of have that quick revving, lighter feeling to them. And again, they've also done some mass centralization. They made some changes to the frame. The 450 motor is actually, the head is lowered, so they were able to kind of drop everything down, like radiators and lines and things like that. So all in all, a bike that I thought last year was the bike of the class, probably, definitely made improvements. And I would say the biggest change is that characteristic and feeling of the motor, just very light, where before it almost felt like you could tell there was a lot of mass spinning, and once that thing got going, when you were really revving it out, it felt like it didn't want to turn. And now, just because of whatever they've done to the chassis, the motor placement, weight placement, it feels like you can chop the throttle and make the thing turn way easier than before. A lot less effort to make it move directions. That was my biggest takeaway on that bike. And everything else on it, from the brakes to the clutch, all that stuff has always been great, still is great.
We had you ride
that was my big takeaway.
Didn't you? I know you did ride the KTM 250 and 350, and that was kind of the same takeaway on those, right? That freer feeling. Right.
Yeah, and I'm going to sound like a broken record talking about all three bikes, Husky and KTM, because they obviously have the exact same engine. And that is the feeling. That's the biggest takeaway that I had. Mm-hmm. Yes, there's shock valving changes and little things to the fork, But the big takeaway for me was that motor and the light feeling.
Now, we don't do shootouts anymore. You mentioned that maybe the Husky might have been the bike of choice. Now, we haven't done shootouts at RacerX in a while because all we do is get grief. And not only just, by the way, from the manufacturers, only one team and brand's going to win, so everybody else is pissed. But I also noticed we also get the fans pissed, or the consumer, or whoever, because they have their bike they like, and if you don't pick their bike, then they think you're just a goddamn idiot if you don't pick the bike that they think's awesome.
Oh, man.
So we don't even do this anymore.
You know, I was just so glad to get out of it because it was a lot of time and effort to pull together test riders, to set up the date, you know, have food and drinks supplied, get the manufacturers on board for a couple of days of testing, and it was a lot of money for them. And then at the end of the day, you got 4 or 5 manufacturers that are pissed, one that's happy. You got, like you're saying, fans of every other bike that didn't win saying how you did it wrong. Oh, you should have done this. You're idiots. You don't know what you're doing.
Yeah.
You got the manufacturers saying, well, you know, that guy used to ride a Kawasaki 5 or 6 years ago, so he probably is picking that one because, you know, you can never find a fair and unbiased test rider, and you're doing it wrong, and you should have old, slow, fat vet guys on there because, you know, we want to know what bike's best for that guy.
Mm-hmm.
It was exhausting. So, you know what? They can have it. We do an introduction. Here's what's new on the bike. Check it out. We'll do a dialed in, which is, okay, we've got more time on this bike. We've met with the manufacturer. We've gone over what they've found. We'll ride all day and come up with our best setting and then share all that information. We feel like that is a really effective way to share specific information about each bike that's usable. And the great part is the people clicking on those videos and watching, they own the bikes. So, you know, everybody watching is watching for a reason because they have one and they want to see maybe they're stumped on a setup issue, or they just want to see where you're set, what we're recommending versus what they have. But it's being utilized, you know. With the shootouts, I know the manufacturers do look at some of those results and the things that test riders say and go back and look at that. But they do the same thing with our dialed-in videos because we'll say if a bike has an issue, hey, here's a problem we ran into. You know, this thing is like this, and we had to do this, this, and this to fix it. So if you're having those same feelings, try this. So I think it's still relevant for them. And again, we make nobody mad. You know, we just offer, hey, here's the direction we think you should go and a good base setting to start with. And then, you know, the last step for us is obviously the project bikes. But I'm really happy we went away from shootouts. They've gotten to be, I won't say irrelevant, but they're just very subjective because I might get on the 450 Cowie and just love it. I think it's the greatest thing since sliced bread. Mm-hmm. And another guy who's a good rider, he knows what he's talking about, he'll jump on and go, yeah, that wasn't great for me. And you're just going, what? I mean, you know, it's like Democrat and Republican. You just can't talk sense into the other guy, right? I mean,
so you've had that happen like on shootout days, like you'll discuss things after the ride, and that's literally what people say.
I'm telling you, you will have 2 riders with polar opposite reviews on a bike. And that is because I don't ride the same as another guy. Somebody who rides off the back is going to be completely different than me. I kind of ride with a lot of weight on the front tire. Mm-hmm. I don't rev the bike. I don't over-clutch the bike. So I have a certain way that I ride and certain characteristics that I like in a bike, and everybody's going to be different. So occasionally you have a bike that is liked by the majority, and so, you know, in a shootout situation, maybe there's some relevancy to that. But also, a lot of times we found in our shootouts, it came down to, you know, one or 2 points, you know, over this whole 2-day spread. Everything's so close, the top 3 or 4 bikes, any one could be a winner. Mm-hmm. So how do I say, well, this is number one just because it has 1 more point than this bike, when really, if I would have mixed up my test riders, I could have completely different results, you know? I just don't like things that are that subjective. So we went away from it, and I don't think we're looking back.
Now, the unfortunate timing that was, I think some of the grief we would get, you had this theory that KTM would always struggle more in the shootouts because the European bike always had a little bit different feel. And when you rode, you know, 4 of the other brands and 1 European bike, it always felt a little weird that day. But the unfortunate thing for KTM, now their bikes are better than they've ever been. And now we don't have shootouts anymore. This was their chance.
No, straight up, the most grief we got was from Tom Moen at KTM. He would piss and moan because his bikes kept getting last. And, man, I'd stand behind exactly what we said. They were last. Back in those, early 2000s, they were the worst bike out there. It wasn't really even close. Now, so he made all this noise and got it to where Davey finally just said, "Hey, guys, we got to stop this because I'm not, I'm getting emails and phone calls." And so that's why we went the other direction. And, yeah, the irony is he'd probably be winning most of the shootouts now with us. So, anyway.
Okay, yeah, so somewhere in your mind is a ranking. We don't need to put it out there right now. But the Husky and the KTM, there's just so much hype around those brands right now. Everything from the race results to the bikes, to the way they look, how often they change them, the weight, which is just a number on a piece of paper. It doesn't necessarily mean everything. But overall, the hype that you hear, these bikes are good. We don't have a shootout, but they're good.
No, they are great bikes. And, there's a couple of things I'd love to find out. And unfortunately, race teams are going to keep this stuff really quiet. But I'd love to get measurements on a KTM frame.
Mm-hmm.
This was always a big deal back when steel frames were the norm. Is you really couldn't, depending on the bike, you couldn't go a whole season on one frame. It would stretch out and the geometry would change so much, it didn't feel the same. So you go through 2 or 3, 4 frames in a season. And so I'm really curious how these KTM and Husky frames hold up in terms of measurements from point A to point B over the course of a year, 2 years, 3 years, guys that keep them. But those are, man, you ask anybody that and everybody kind of changes the subject and no one will give you a straight answer. And it is tough to quantify because a guy that weighs 230 pounds, his frame's going to look a little different than a 160-pound guy, right, who's riding trails. But I'd be curious to get some of those numbers just because it was such an issue back then. I don't know how or why it would have changed for now, but that's something to consider. And then, I haven't ridden all the bikes, but I'm really impressed with the Japanese manufacturers stepping up.
Mm-hmm.
KTM and Husky have pushed so hard with this factory edition and the Rockstar edition. I mean, they're able to build 2 bikes a year, so they're cutting their development time in half.
Mm-hmm.
As far as when they make a change. I mean, forget the 4 or 5 year rule. It's like every 6 months they're making changes.
Yeah.
And so you could see, in the last 2, 3, 4 years, you could see the writing on the wall. Like, these guys better move or they're going to become irrelevant. They will become irrelevant. No one will be riding a Japanese brand. And so to see Cowie really step up with this bike, I feel like they really swung hard. And then now you look at what Honda did with the Works Edition to kind of compete with that, and that'll be interesting to see if they. Right now, it just has the Yosh exhaust on it, and it's got maybe it's got this same Showa A-kit suspension that the Cowie comes with. I don't know. We'll have to see tomorrow. I'm actually riding it tomorrow, but they are responding, and I think that's good for everybody. I think that pushes all the manufacturers to make better products. So.
Another thing I always hear, the KTMs are always very light. And when I've heard the kind of behind-the-scenes rumblings of the Japanese brands they're like, yeah, but they can't hold up, man. We have internal standards of durability, and there's no way the KTM could ever survive the durability test that we require of our motorcycle, so this is unfair. Sure, they can take 6 or 8 or 10 pounds out, but their trannies are going to blow up, and ours won't. But have you heard that? Have you heard that KTMs are unreliable, especially they've chopped so much weight lately?
I will tell you this, because I get tagged into every post where there's a bike broken in half.
Okay.
David Pingree,
You're the OG
truly,
bike broken in half guy. I love it.
Once a week I get tagged in, was Ping riding it? And it's a bike broken in half. And invariably, those bikes are KTMs.
Oh, just like they were.
Well, and I don't mean that to disparage them. I'm just saying that's just a fact. I don't get sent pictures of Cowies or Hondas broken in half.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that there probably is a little bit of truth to that. The Japanese are very stringent with their standards, I think for reliability reasons, mostly. But, I don't know if there's something to that. I would say that's my concern about the frame, is that's the one thing that's where they're saving weight because it's much lighter than the aluminum frames because you got to make the aluminum so thick. But I know as far as internals, you don't really hear of any issues with those things. They just went to a Pankel transmission, which is, I mean, as good or better than anything out there. So
Yeah.
I don't think that's an issue. I don't think it's with the engine or necessarily components. If there was one weak point where over time you would have a failure, it's going to be in the frame, whether that's a foot peg mount cracking or, the steering stem snapping off. I mean, if there's going to be a failure, that's the weak point, in my opinion.
Yeah, and to be fair, a lot of these jabs that I'm hearing at them, let's be honest, I think a lot of it is powered by jealousy. If you're one of these other brands and all you keep hearing about is KTM, 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 you're going to try to find holes to defend yourself and be like, yeah, well, that's because of this and this and this, and you don't realize this and this. So I think that's why I hear more of those rumblings. Whoever's on top is going to be the one that gets picked on the most.
Of course.
Yeah. So
of course.
Yep.
And look, KTM and my guess is now Husky are dominating market share. I mean, it's not even close. They've off-road and racing, they are crushing everybody. So you're right. There's definitely going to be some pushback from the Japanese in wherever they can get it.
Last year, Honda changed their 250. They had an all-new motor, especially, which the old one had been around for a long time, and it followed the redesigned chassis of the 450 from the previous year that a lot of people liked. I first saw that Honda 250. They had Andrew Short riding at Loretta Lynn's. This would have been at the end of, wait, I got my years right? This would have been the end of 16.
End of 17.
End of 17, yeah, that's right. And he was so big on, he's like, for the first time, Honda's building a 250 motor that's actually built really it's built to rev. It's built for a more aggressive pro-level rider. We always had motors that were a little more accessible, a little more low-end, easier to ride, and we decided for a 250, we're abandoning that philosophy. So to me, I'm like, wow, this is going to be really effective, especially at the highest levels. So when you rode Honda's new 250 last year, did you get that out of it? Did it feel like, oh my God, this is so much faster and revs so much more than the old one?
No, it did rev.
Yeah.
It did rev further, for sure. There's no question. The power all got moved up.
Mm-hmm.
But they showed us a dyno chart, which I thought it was crazy. They showed us this at the introduction dinner. And I guess there's no point in hiding it because we're going to feel it, but the power curve all the way up the front side was less on that 18. And then just at the super high RPMs, you're getting to like 10,000 RPMs. Then it crosses over and it made way more peak power, and it revved further. But anytime you give up, like where you're spending most of your time on the track, it's all that face, that front side. And so I was stunned that they gave all that up just to get that little bit of peak.
Right.
And I kept asking questions like, why did you guys go this route? I mean, surely you could have made something either in the middle of the two or, kind of a happy medium. I feel like you gave up all this low and middle for this over-rev, And they said, well, this design is going to allow for further development, in terms of aftermarket and models that come down the road, getting away from the Unicam design and stuff. So that was their explanation of it. I would just tell you that it feels soft, that engine does. Yeah, it revs, but you're going to be bummed out, I think, in stock trim with just how that thing comes out of turns and pulls through the middle. I wouldn't say that it's any harder to ride than the old bike was. Still a nice, easy power to ride for a novice, beginner, whatever. You give up a little that nice middle where you want it, and they just pushed it up to the top.
Maybe this is the example of the.
I had heard.
Yep. The example of the new bike. Go ahead. Yep. You heard.
Well, I was going to say, I heard a lot of chatter coming out of the Geico Honda pits that they were working hard to get that thing to run and make the numbers that they had on their previous bike. It was a lot of work, and it always is anytime you have a completely new engine, right? But I think it was a challenge for them. So I think you'll see them, continue to get better as they continue to develop it. But
yeah, I heard that too.
It was a curious move.
I heard that too, and that's what surprised me.
Great.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I just think it'll. We talked about a bike either just completely hitting the mark on year one or taking some time and some years. And I think that 250 will take a few years to get whatever the tweaks are to the mapping to the engine to make it where it needed to be. They kind of, to me, gave up too much middle for that little bit of top.
But the bike handles well. You like the chassis and everything like that. Yep.
The chassis is amazing. Yeah, very similar to the 450 as far as the way it feels, just very stable, turns well. I mean, no complaints on it. The thing with the 250 is motor is almost everything, right? I mean,
right.
It's so important. So for them to give up all that good meat in the middle, I was just like, huh. A little surprising.
Yeah, and I was surprised too because just again when I heard, oh man, it has the real twin pipes and dual overhead cams, I'm like, oh, this is going to be so much easier for the race team to just gain 4 horsepower from last year. But to actually hear, no, it didn't really end up working that direction. They had to work harder to get to where they were. It was a little surprising. But like you said,
yeah, and you know, I believe that they'll come around and they'll find their little tricks and okay, we need to do this, not this. And that's just takes time, you know. Anytime you have a brand new bike, that's just the way it is. It just takes some time.
Now, Yamaha's the YZ250F, the one thing that Yamaha engine design does, it makes great power. So where the 450's had its struggles, the 250 has been, ever since they switched to that, I think they would have been 14 or so. That's people have liked that bike, and it's certainly been successful in racing. So now they've actually changed the 250 into a new generation. But that, I don't get it. I've seen them. I actually saw one of the Yamaha dealers had one at RedBud there on display, but has it actually been ridden yet by the press, the new YZ250F?
Yeah, there's an embargo. I think it lifts here later this week.
Oh, okay.
But it has been ridden. Haven't heard anything yet. We're riding it Friday.
Okay.
So I'll know a little more then. But, yeah, anxious to see what they've done there. That just the design with the air being fed in from the top, man, it's just a great design. So especially on that 250, like I said, where power is king, those bikes are, you know, with the power being what they are and being a little lighter, handling is much easier to figure out on that than it is on a 450. And that makes just making horsepower the big issue. And Yamaha's been king for the last several years, for sure.
Yeah, well, it's just funny because this is what I hear a lot of people on the sidelines will tell me. They're like, it's so weird. The bike in the 250s I hear the most about being great is the Yamaha, and the bike in the 450s I hear the most about being hard to ride is the Yamaha. How could they be so far off? And I'm like, well, believe it or not, it's kind of the same thing with each. It's just that power is so important on the 250, it doesn't really matter. And in the 450, it's great to have it, but it's not everything. So it actually makes sense as much as it shouldn't make sense that they could be on two sides of the same spectrum.
Absolutely. That extra weight, that rotating mass, the extra weight, the extra horsepower. I mean, just the more horsepower you put into a bike, the harder it is to get it to handle. And that's why a lot of the 450s out now all make so much power. And they'll tell you, these teams could squeeze another 8 horsepower out of these things if they wanted.
Wow.
I mean, it's crazy. Like the numbers that we used to make in Supermoto, because in that discipline, it's the more the better. You know, you've got 100% traction. It puts a lot of load on it, and you want as much horsepower as you can possibly squeeze out of the bikes. And so the numbers we were making were ridiculous. But you literally couldn't ride it on the dirt. It would just blow out of your hands, and you'd fly off the track. It was crazy. So the big thing that they all focus on now is delivery, and how does it, the characteristic that we give it so that you can actually use it and not wear yourself out in 2 laps. And I think Yamaha was a little aggressive with their settings for those first couple of years. It made a ton of horsepower, but it was really tough to ride. It was a little too abrupt, and they've definitely made some changes to smooth that power out, and then also have the app where you can go in, and if you want it even softer, smoother, whatever, you can make all those changes yourself.
Hey, about that app. So this longtime Honda guy that I knew who everything's great Honda and everything else sucks. He tells me last year, he's like, oh yeah, real smart Yamaha. Now people can just walk down to the line and totally sabotage your bike with Bluetooth. Is that possible?
Well, I guess if somebody was good at hacking into things, your phone syncs up with your specific bike.
Okay.
So you can't just go to the line and start changing everybody's mapping on a Yamaha. So
it's a good theory. Good idea.
It makes for a good story. I guess what do they say? Never let the facts get in the way of a good story.
That's right. So the 450 Yamaha has come a long enough way now. I guess it still feels different, but it's not way out in left field like it was.
No. It's definitely, if you go back to that first gen reverse engine bike and rode it against this one, boy, you'd really appreciate the new one. And it's gotten way better. But I would still tell you, as far as handling goes, it's just, there's something that feels different about it. It's almost like that's the one that takes you a little bit of time to get used to. And truly, up until last year, I felt like last year they made a really big step. And then, again, I haven't ridden this year. We're riding it this Friday, but I'm anxious to see what changes they made to kind of continue to evolve that. But it was just always felt like, to me, even if it wasn't, it felt like the wheelbase was very short, and there was a lot of yaw, like front and back. So when I grab brakes, the back end would get really high. When I come out of a turn, the front end was high, and there was just too much movement of the chassis forward and back. And then if you unweighted the back, then the back end would dance around. And if you unweighted the front, it wanted to kind of to search too. So, again, there was a lot of changes they made to fix that. Dropping different heights of. We were dropping forks in the clamps and making changes like that last year that made a big difference. So I'm guessing some of that'll be a standard issue on the 2019.
Okay, last one to talk about here is Suzuki. So it became this hilarious running joke to make fun of how long Suzuki had gone without changing their bike. Although a lot of that was they hadn't changed the look. There were subtler changes. It wasn't. I think people were a little misinformed. They thought it was literally like the 2016 Suzuki was identical to the 2009. Like, that wasn't actually true, right? It just looked the same. It was different. Maybe not totally different.
Yeah, it just looked the same.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're not going to make, again, there's all kinds of reasons why they don't retool and make different this or that. But, boy, it's not too tough to really change the stickers, right?
Right.
In one day, a guy could sit at a computer and go, hey, what do you guys think of that look? Cool, let's do it. Run it. Print it.
Yes.
But Suzuki just didn't. They would change, like, the font, or they would move one line up, they looked really similar for years.
Yeah.
And then, that 450 last year, and again, I haven't had my turn on the 19s yet, and I know the 250's got a bunch of changes, so I'm really excited to see how those work.
Yep.
But I'll tell you, the 450 last year was a little bit of a disappointment. We waited so long for a big update, and then I think they took a chance on that new suspension, and I just don't think there was enough time on it with different teams to find good settings and figure it out, and they paid the price. It required a whole bunch of sag to make it balance. The adjusters were different. They no longer went by clicks. It was just turns, and everyone was trying to figure that out, and it was kind of screwy. The power, I was thinking, all right, well, at least these guys need to, put it on a diet and add some horsepower to it, because I love the characteristic of the old motor. It just kind of went flat. It wasn't a broad enough power, and probably could have used a little more on the middle and top. And it just didn't hit the mark. There would be another bike that hopefully continues to evolve, but when it came out last year, it was a little disappointing. And we did a project bike that Pro Circuit helped us with. Bones spent a whole day with me working on the suspension. We put a exhaust and a piston. I think that was just it. A piston and an exhaust system. And a completely different bike. Just that. I'm like, man, it's not like they're far off. When you could put a high compression piston in an exhaust system that just probably helps it flow a little better, drop some weight off the thing. And it felt like a completely different bike. Felt like a race bike again, rather than this kind of, I don't know. It wasn't great in stock trim. So
yeah, it was funny because I felt like for 3 or 4 years you were saying the same thing. Like, I love the way the Suzuki feels. It has good characteristic. The handling is good. It just needs an update. It just needs to lose some weight and maybe gain some power. And I think that you didn't like the forks. And then this new one comes, and they didn't actually fix any of those things I felt like that you wanted them to fix.
Well, they went to a spring fork.
Okay, so the fork got better.
Yeah, the fork was better, but again, the setting in it wasn't great. So, I feel like if Suzuki would just say, okay, forget it. Let's put what Kawasaki did. Let's put that Showa A-Kit stuff on here.
Yeah.
Let's rework the exhaust system, because the thing weighs like 80 pounds. It's like a boat anchor.
Mm-hmm.
Let's just take 5 pounds off the exhaust system somehow, and then let's, add a little more compression to this piston.
Yeah.
Like, they're in the game. That's a competitive bike again. That's it. I mean, it seems so easy to do from here, but...
Yeah. It was a weird thing where the old Suzuki was being made fun of for being so old, but at the same time, it was both known as being old but also really good. And I'm like, well, this is the same bike that Roxon's cleaning everybody's clock on, and he's like, I got to get off of a KTM because this Suzuki is so good. That's what I love. And Stewart had done the same thing. Like, it was strange to me that dudes loved riding it but also made fun of it for being old at the same time.
Well, listen, that bike was the most successful 450 bike over the span of probably 2 decades.
That's what they said. It was since they started racing 450s, it had won the most 450 races, essentially.
Yeah. I mean, look at the guys that crushed it on that thing. Reedy, Ricky, Dungy, that sucker won some titles and some races. So, the problem is once Roger left, I feel like development just stopped. There was no more pushing forward, and until last year, and then again the changes weren't. They just swung and missed a little bit.
Is the Suzuki 250, which is they redid the 250? They just announced that today. It looks like the new 450 from last year, so the chassis has been changed. Is the Suzuki 250, in your experience, is it just straight up slow? Is that an issue, or is it not? I mean, Mathis goes off on these things all the time, but is it slow?
It's slow.
Okay.
It got behind. I mean, it was it followed the same path as the 450 as far as it just got outdated. Like, they didn't make enough improvements where everyone else was still getting better and better. But the 450 was really, really competitive. Like I said, when Ricky and those guys were racing it, the 250 was it was just okay, and so it got left behind even more. That margin between the other bikes and it was bigger than the 450 was, I think, particularly in terms of the motor. It still turned well. The chassis was good. The fork just sucked. So, again, I got my fingers crossed that I think they'll be back to, they're probably going to have the same exact fork and shock that they had last year, the new Showa stuff. I just hope they've got a better setting. I hope they've got that stuff worked out a little bit better. And then I hope, fingers crossed, because I'm a big Suzuki fan, man. I spent a lot of my career on them, and just for me, I always get on them and they feel comfortable. It's just a very comfortable, easy to ride bike. So I quietly root for them, but fingers crossed they did some work inside that engine on the 250 because it needed it.
Last thing on that is there a chance that, okay, I'm terrible, I'm slow, I'm not trying to race anymore. If I go to the track, I'm just having to have fun. Even one of these 250s, even one that's quote-unquote slow, like a Suzuki, for a person that just wants to go ride, does that even matter? Like, are they fast enough to...
No.
Right.
It doesn't matter. And this is another reason I went away from shootouts.
Yeah.
It's all subjective. So if you sit on the cow and you go, oh, this is it. This thing just feels like putting on a nice tennis shoe. It just fits me. Another guy might hate it. And it's the same thing with the Suzuki. I mean, a guy gets on it, and if it just is comfortable to him, and he's just a cruiser, he's, riding the trails or tracks on the weekend, that, the fact that it's a little slower than the KTM or the Yamaha, who cares? I mean, truly, unless you're competing at a very high level, I would say like good intermediate rider or better. I say this all the time when people ask me, go to your local dealer, the one that's going to take the best care of you. Maybe this guy gives you a deal on parts, maybe he gives you a deal on service, or he's whatever. Find the dealer that's going to support you the best and all of those things that come after the bike purchase, because that's, that stuff can really add up, and buy from him. And then if he sells 3 different brands, okay, try to go ride the 3 of them, from somebody, a buddy's bike or whatever you can do, and get on whatever one feels comfortable. Because don't look at, I wouldn't read shootouts. I wouldn't look at dyno charts. I wouldn't look at any of that crap, because unless you are very, very, very high level, it doesn't matter. It just doesn't.
Yeah, because all we hear is that, especially maybe more so in California than anywhere else, tons of people ride and don't race. And then I hear all these discussions that's discussing like maybe the final 10% of a bike. And I'm like, dude, probably if you're just going to the track every Sunday afternoon to do some laps, even the Suzuki 250 is probably fine. But it doesn't come across that way. It's funny. Yeah.
I know. That's the, we get down to, and this is why I would say, again, going back to shootouts, they are splitting hairs.
Yeah.
For the most part. Mm-hmm. And hairs that you can't even see. It's like ridiculous. So it's just a way for them to sell magazines. It's something they've always done. It was, I think, more relevant in the 80s, back when there was a huge difference between a Honda and a, Kajiva or whatever. You know what I mean?
Right.
You could very definitively say you probably shouldn't buy that bike unless you like buying parts and working on it. The Honda's the bike. If you want to win races, that's the one you need to buy. Back then, there was a pretty big separation. Mm-hmm. It's just not like that anymore. Even the Suzuki 250 right now, which is hands down the slowest 250F, if you could if you're just a weekend warrior dude or just ride some trails or just whatever, and you can get a smoking deal on a 2017 that's down at the shop, get it. I mean, the only thing that would bite you is maybe resale. So, I guess consider that and whatever. But if you get a good enough deal on it, or you plan on keeping it for a long time or whatever, it's not like they're not reliable. They don't blow up. There's not issues with them like that. And you aren't going to be able to tell the difference between, well, this one makes, 39 horsepower and this one makes 41. You won't even feel it.
Right, exactly. Here's the ultimate test. Ask yourself how many times you're actually wide open saying I need more. And if you don't ever go wide open, does it even matter at that point?
Yeah. And most of the time when guys say that, they're just over-revving it. If they would just shift, the problems would be over.
That's right. Okay, that's what it is for now. We'll have to do another one of these because I guess you've got YZ250F, which is new, and Honda, which is new, 450 coming up. So maybe we'll check in with you again next week to get a little bit bigger swing.
Yeah, as well as all the Suzukis. So, yeah, we could definitely, if you want to circle back, we can fill in those holes and give you another update.
Yeah, I'm just trying to stay away from asking about two-strokes because I feel like that's all you have to talk about in your column every Friday. So I'm just trying to somehow be the one guy that doesn't ask you a question about two-strokes.
Well, that's the only questions I get.
I know.
I throw so many away. I'm like, no, I'm always talking about two-strokes or, whatever. I don't want to be that guy that I try to find different stuff, but that's all I get asked.
No, I know.
Hey, man, what do you think if they went to this, if you could just all ride two-strokes again? I'm like, man.
Exactly. It's like it's like dealing with your kids, like when they want a gift for Christmas that you can't give them, and they just, if I ask the question a different way, maybe the answer will be yes.
Yeah.
I don't know what to say, man. I got you, but I don't know what to do about it.
I know. And sometimes I'm like, man, do you not read my column? Because I swear I've answered this like 3 times. And they'll ask me the same question.
We're just going to change it to Ask Ping about two-strokes. That's what we're going to call. That's what we're going to call a column from now on.
That's funny.
All right.
Yeah. Well, you could.
Yep. All right. Well, thanks for this. That's good info, and it proves that RacerX actually somewhat knows what they're talking about. At least we have you to know what they're talking about with bikes. And
well,
yeah.
Yeah. No worries, man. I'm always happy to do them. So just
Yep.
Give me some heads up, and we'll knock them out.
All right. Yeah. Have fun riding the new ones, and we'll circle back. Thanks for the time, man.
You got it. Sounds good.
All right, Ping. That's our show for this week. We will have some updates. I'll get Ping back on the phone. We'll talk about riding new Hondas and riding the YZ250F, also the KTM 450, which may or may not feel like the Husky 450 that he's already ridden. So we'll circle back a little bit. Meanwhile, I'm on the road, headed back to Lucas Oil Pro Motocross at Millville. We'll have Ryan Dungey in the booth for both 450 motos this weekend. We had a really good time. We had Adamson Cerullo join us on the show for our 250 motos at the last race at RedBud. So Dungy will be in there for our first 450 Moto on MAV TV, our second 450 Moto on NBCSN, or just sign up for the NBC Sports Gold package, and you'll be able to watch every single Moto and our practice shows on Saturday morning anywhere you go. Like, you can literally be fishing because it's a nice day out, summertime, and just watch the Motos on your phone. I know people that have done that. There's no excuse. Just pay a few bucks. Like, it's cheap. I think it's down to $30 now that we're halfway through the year. Big thanks always to our sponsor, Yoshimura. 63 years of four-stroke research and development. Check them out, yoshimura-rd.com. By the way, those pipes are made in the U.S., so we don't have to worry about tariff wars here. Yosh pipes are good to go. In fact, Trump's probably going to hold a Yoshimura pipe up over his head as an example of something that he would or wouldn't use. I never know. But he would be pumped on, Trump would be pumped on Yosh, because they might sound Japanese, but they make the stuff in the U.S. The Yoshimura people are probably listening now, freaking out, because there's probably some part they import from somewhere else, and it's subject to tariff, and now they're going to call me right now as soon as they hear this. No, don't say that. Racer X Wear, check it out, racerxbrand.com. We've got Motocross of Nations shirts coming. We've got shirts, hats, all kinds of cool stuff. 20% off. Type in exhaust, the word all caps, into the promo code. And that's it for our show.